Nearly $90 million in Bitcoin gone, not stolen from some sketchy exchange, not lost to a phishing scam, stolen from cold storage. The exact method every crypto expert tells you is the safest way to protect your Bitcoin: offline hardware wallets. Over 4,500 addresses drained. And the vulnerability that made it possible, it had been sitting there since 2021, 5 years. Nobody knew. Welcome back to Currency Arc Insight, where we break down what's really happening beneath the surface of the global economy. The risks, the warnings, and the moves smart investors are making before the headlines catch up. If you're new here, consider subscribing, because what we're about to unpack today has direct implications for how you think about asset security. In the world of digital assets, few promises are repeated as often or as confidently as the idea that cold storage keeps Bitcoin safe. Take it off the exchange, move it into a hardware wallet, disconnect it from the internet. That is the advice given by nearly every security expert, every crypto influencer, and every online guide dedicated to protecting digital wealth. It is treated as the gold standard of self-custody, the final step that separates a careless holder from a responsible one. But a recent security event has forced a difficult reconsideration of that advice, and the numbers involved are difficult to ignore. Security researchers and blockchain analysts have traced a coordinated theft totaling close to $90 million in Bitcoin. The attack did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded across 3 distinct waves, each one draining funds from previously secure wallets. When the total losses were calculated, the scope became clear. More than 1,300 Bitcoin, stolen from over 4,500 separate wallet addresses. This was not an isolated hack against a single high-value target. It was a systemic breach affecting thousands of individual holders, many of whom had no reason to believe they were at risk. What makes this event particularly significant is not simply the dollar amount, though $90 million is a staggering figure by any measure. What makes it significant is who the victims were and what they had done to protect themselves. These were not users who left their funds sitting on a centralized exchange, exposed to the kind of institutional failure that has claimed billions of dollars in the crypto industry over the years. These were not victims of a phishing email or a fraudulent website designed to trick them into surrendering their private keys through carelessness or human error. The victims in this case had done everything that responsible Bitcoin ownership is supposed to require. They had moved their holdings into offline hardware wallets, specifically designed to keep private keys away from internet-connected devices and, in theory, beyond the reach of remote attackers. This details what transforms the story from a routine security incident into something far more unsettling for the broader digital asset community. Cold storage has long been marketed and understood as the closest thing to an unhackable solution in the world of cryptocurrency. The entire premise rests on physical separation. If a private key never touches the internet, the logic goes, it cannot be remotely compromised. That logic has driven millions of Bitcoin holders around the world to invest in hardware wallets, treating them as a final and definitive layer of protection against theft. Yet the reporting on this breach reveals that the vulnerability exploited by attackers had nothing to do with careless behavior on the part of the victims. It was not a matter of exposed keys, weak passwords, or a lapse in operational security. Instead, it traces back to the fundamental process used to generate the wallets themselves, a flaw embedded at the manufacturing and firmware level, long before any of these victims ever purchased their devices or secured their savings inside them. In other words, the compromise did not originate from a mistake made by the people who lost their funds. It originated from a structural weakness in the very tool they trusted to keep those funds safe. This distinction matters enormously. For years, the crypto security conversation has centered heavily on user behavior. Do not click suspicious links, do not reuse passwords, do not store your seed phrase on a device connected to the internet. Do not trust custodians with your funds. Self-custody has been positioned as the ultimate solution to nearly every one of these risks, a way of taking full personal responsibility and, by extension, full control over the safety of one's assets. But this breach demonstrates that self-custody by itself does not guarantee safety. It merely shifts the nature of the risk from one set of variables to another, from trusting a third party with your funds to trusting the hardware and software that generated your private keys in the first place. The immediate financial toll is significant on its own. $90 million stolen across thousands of addresses represents a substantial and painful loss for the individuals affected. But the deeper implication extends well beyond this single event. It raises a pressing question about how many other wallets, generated using the same flawed process, remain vulnerable right now, undetected, sitting quietly in cold storage, waiting for someone to eventually notice. To understand how thousands of supposedly secure hardware wallets could be compromised without any action or error on the part of their owners, it is necessary to look at the technical root of the failure. According to the reporting surrounding this breach, the vulnerability traces back to a firmware release from March of 2021, over 5 years before the theft was discovered. That gap alone is worth pausing on. A flaw introduced half a decade ago sat completely undetected, silently compromising the security of every wallet generated under its influence, while those wallet owners went about their lives believing their holdings were protected. At the center of the issue is a process most Bitcoin holders rarely think about: the generation of a seed phrase. A seed phrase is the foundation of a Bitcoin wallet's security. It is a string of words that serves as the master key, the single piece of information required to reconstruct every private key controlling access to the funds stored within that wallet. For this system to work securely, the seed phrase must be generated using true randomness, ideally produced by a dedicated hardware random number generator built specifically to resist prediction or replication. That is what was supposed to happen. Instead, due to a flaw in the firmware, certain wallets generated their seed phrases using a predictable software randomizer rather than the hardware-based process they were designed to rely on. This may sound like a minor technical distinction, but its consequences are severe. A true hardware random number generator produces outcomes that are, for all practical purposes, impossible to predict or reproduce. A software randomizer, particularly one with underlying flaws, can behave in ways that are far more limited and far more predictable than intended. When randomness is compromised, the total universe of possible private keys shrinks dramatically. What should have been an effectively infinite range of possible outcomes became, in practice, a much smaller and more calculable set. This is where the danger fully reveals itself. Once someone identified the pattern behind this flawed randomization process, an attacker equipped with sufficient computing power did not need to breach any network, intercept any communication, or gain physical access to a single hardware wallet. They could work entirely offline, using the predictable nature of the flawed randomizer to reconstruct the private keys tied to affected wallets. From there, draining the funds became a matter of execution rather than discovery. The wallets were never hacked in the traditional sense. Their supposed security was undermined from the moment they were created. This is precisely what makes the 5-year timeline so unsettling. Somewhere during that stretch, a Bitcoin holder could have generated a wallet using this compromised firmware, transferred their savings into it, tucked the physical device away in a drawer or a safe, and moved on with complete confidence that their funds were protected. There was no warning sign, no unusual activity, no indication whatsoever that the foundation of their wallet's security had been compromised before they ever touched it. The vulnerability existed silently, waiting for years, until someone with the right knowledge and the right computing resources figured out how to exploit it. There's also a broader dimension to this story that extends beyond Bitcoin itself, and it centers on the growing role of artificial intelligence in both defending and attacking digital systems. As AI tools become increasingly capable of analyzing massive volumes of code, identifying patterns, and surfacing hidden vulnerabilities, that capability cuts in two directions. On one hand, developers can use these same tools defensively, scanning their own systems for weaknesses before those weaknesses can be exploited. On the other hand, attackers have access to the same category of tools and can use them to hunt for undiscovered flaws in software and firmware that millions of people depend on every single day. This raises an uncomfortable question that extends well past this particular breach. How many similar vulnerabilities currently exist embedded in the hardware and software that people trust with their savings, simply because no one, malicious or otherwise, has uncovered them yet? The Bitcoin wallet breach is not necessarily an isolated case. It may be one of the first visible examples of a much larger and more systemic issue, one where flaws introduced years earlier remain dormant until the right combination of knowledge, motive, and computing power brings them to the surface. For years, one phrase has dominated conversations about digital asset security: not your keys, not your coins. It has become something close to gospel within the cryptocurrency community, a simple, memorable principle meant to capture an important truth. If you do not personally control the private keys to your Bitcoin, you do not truly own it. You are trusting someone else, an exchange, a custodian, a third-party platform, to hold and safeguard your wealth on your behalf, and history has shown repeatedly how that trust can be betrayed. Exchanges collapse, custodians mismanage funds, platforms freeze withdrawals or disappear entirely. Self-custody was positioned as the solution to all of it, a way of removing the middleman and eliminating the possibility of someone else failing you. This breach forces a more uncomfortable examination of that principle. Self-custody does remove the bank, it does remove the exchange, it does remove the financial intermediary who might mismanage or misappropriate funds. But removing those specific parties does not mean removing dependency altogether. It simply changes what that dependency looks like. Instead of depending on a company or an institution, the Bitcoin holder is now depending on something less visible but no less critical. The cryptography underlying the system, the software running on their device, the hardware manufactured by a private company, and the human engineers who designed and implemented every layer of that process correctly. Self-custody does not mean independence from risk. It means trading one category of risk for another. That distinction matters because it is so easily overlooked. When someone moves their Bitcoin into a hardware wallet, there is a natural psychological shift that occurs. The funds feel secure. The threat feels neutralized. The narrative around cold storage has been so effective that many holders stop actively thinking about risk altogether once their coins are offline. But this event demonstrates that the underlying dependency never disappeared. It simply moved further back in the chain, into a firmware release from 2021, into a random number generator that behaved in ways nobody caught for half a decade, into a manufacturing and development process that, like any human process, is capable of error. This is where the growing role of artificial intelligence becomes especially relevant and especially concerning. As AI systems become more capable of scanning enormous code bases, identifying irregular patterns, and surfacing vulnerabilities that would take human reviewers months or years to find, the balance of power in digital security is shifting. In principle, this capability strengthens defense. Developers can use AI to audit their own systems, catching flaws before they are ever exploited. But the same tools are available to those with far less constructive intentions. An attacker equipped with sophisticated AI-assisted code analysis does not need to wait for a public disclosure or a whistleblower. They can search directly for the next undiscovered flaw in the next widely used piece of hardware or software, long before anyone else even knows it exists. This raises a question that extends well beyond this single breach, and well beyond Bitcoin itself. How many vulnerabilities are sitting right now inside the software and hardware that people rely on every single day? Not yet discovered, not yet exploited, simply waiting for the right combination of curiosity, computing power, and motive to bring them into the light. It is not a comfortable question, but it is an increasingly necessary one. The tools capable of finding these flaws are advancing quickly, and there is no guarantee that the first person to discover the next one will be acting in good faith. None of this means that self-custody is without value, or that hardware wallets are inherently untrustworthy as a category. It means something more specific and more important, that removing a financial intermediary does not equate to removing risk entirely. It shifts risk into a form that is harder to see, harder to audit personally, and dependent on the correct behavior of code, hardware, and people that the average holder will never interact with directly. Control, in this context, is more of an illusion than an absolute. And that illusion is precisely what makes an event like this so consequential, because it challenges an assumption that much of the digital asset world has been built upon. Set against everything uncovered in this breach, physical gold and silver occupy a fundamentally different category of asset, and the contrast becomes especially clear once the technical details of the Bitcoin vulnerability are fully understood. When someone holds an ounce of silver or gold in their hand, there is no software standing between them and the asset. There is no password required to access it. There is no private key that could have been generated using a flawed randomizer. There is no firmware, no blockchain ledger that must correctly record and preserve ownership, and no developer somewhere who needs to discover a bug and release a patch before the asset can remain secure. The physical metal simply exists, in hand, complete, and self-contained. It is worth being precise with language here, because the comparison should not be overstated. What happened with these Bitcoin wallets is not counterparty risk in the strict traditional financial sense. Bitcoin itself did not fail. The hardware wallet manufacturer did not owe these victims Bitcoin, and then default on that obligation the way a bank or a custodian might. But the event illustrates something closely related, something that tends to get lost when people argue that Bitcoin has eliminated counterparty risk altogether. It is possible to eliminate the bank. It is possible to eliminate the exchange. It is possible to eliminate the financial intermediary entirely. But eliminating those specific parties does not mean eliminating dependency. The Bitcoin holder is still depending on cryptography behaving as intended, on software functioning correctly, on hardware being manufactured without flaws, and on the human beings responsible for each of those layers getting it right, every single time, without exception. Physical precious metals operate on an entirely different foundation because gold and silver were not invented by human beings. Certain forms of them carry human design, certainly. A minted coin has a design stamped into it. A goldback has ink and fractional denominations printed onto it. Humans shaped these products, assigned them serial numbers, and structured how they are bought and sold. But the underlying properties that make the metal valuable in the first place, its density, its rarity, its resistance to corrosion, its conductivity, none of that comes from ink, from a mint's stamping process, or from any human design decision. Those properties come from the laws of physics. They exist independently of any government, corporation, programmer, or civilization. This is in part what people mean when gold and silver are sometimes referred to as nature's money. That description does not require a religious interpretation, though it certainly can carry one for those who see it that way. The core point stands on its own. The fundamental characteristics that make these metals valuable were not created by any institution. They simply exist, embedded in the physical world. To be fair and balanced about this comparison, physical precious metals are not entirely free of risk. Theft remains a real possibility, the same as with any valuable physical asset. Loss is possible too, whether through carelessness or unfortunate circumstance. Counterfeiting is a genuine concern in the metals market, and a bar or coin without a clearly verified chain of custody could, in theory, be adulterated with a base metal, requiring testing or verification to confirm its authenticity. And if someone chooses to store their gold or silver with a third-party vault, rather than keeping it in personal possession, counterparty risk re-enters the picture in a very familiar form, since that arrangement once again involves trusting another party to hold and protect the asset correctly. But once the metal has been verified and is in direct personal possession, the ownership relationship becomes remarkably simple. There is the individual, and there is the metal. That is essentially the entire equation. No network needs to remain online for that ownership to remain valid. No internet connection is required to confirm the asset is still there. There is no software carrying a hidden bug that might surface years later. No vulnerability discovered 5 years from now is going to reach back in time and alter the physical properties of the silver or gold sitting in someone's possession today. In a world where an increasing share of what people own is quietly dependent on technology controlled by someone else, that kind of simplicity and independence has become an increasingly rare characteristic and an increasingly valuable one. When all of the details of this breach are laid side by side, from the flawed firmware sitting undetected for 5 years, to the predictable randomizer that quietly narrowed the odds against thousands of Bitcoin holders, to the growing capability of artificial intelligence to uncover vulnerabilities that no human reviewer would ever catch in time, a larger and more philosophical point begins to emerge. It is not simply a story about one breach, one flawed device, or one unlucky group of victims. It is a story about the nature of dependency itself, and about what it truly means to own something outright. Gold and silver's core value does not originate from a government decree, a corporate design decision, or a line of code written by a programmer somewhere. Density, rarity, conductivity, resistance to corrosion, the properties that give these metals lasting value come directly from the laws of physics. They existed before any financial system was built around them, and they will continue to exist regardless of what happens to any particular institution, currency, or piece of software. That is a fundamentally different kind of value than an asset whose security depends on an unbroken chain of correct decisions made by manufacturers, developers, and engineers, any one of whom, at any point, could introduce a flaw that remains hidden for years. This is precisely what separates holding a physical asset in hand from holding an asset that depends on trust and code. When someone owns a silver coin or a gold bar directly, the relationship is straightforward. There's the individual, and there's the metal, with nothing standing between them that could quietly fail, get patched incorrectly, or be exploited by someone with the right tools and enough patience. That simplicity is not a minor detail. In a financial world becoming more digitized and more dependent on unseen technical infrastructure every year, that kind of independence is becoming harder and harder to find. None of this is an argument against Bitcoin as a technology, or a suggestion that digital assets have no place in a modern portfolio. Bitcoin has its own strengths, and there is a legitimate role for it in the broader financial landscape. But this event serves as a clear and important reminder that self-custody and true independence from risk are not the same thing, and that even the most carefully designed systems can carry vulnerabilities that remain invisible for years. It is a case for diversification, not division, a case for holding tangible assets, ones that do not depend on firmware, software, or the flawless execution of a development team, alongside whatever role digital assets play in an individual's broader strategy. That is really the heart of why physical gold and silver continue to hold a place in a well-built portfolio. Not because every other asset is inherently flawed or untrustworthy, but because true diversification means owning something that does not share the same dependencies, the same points of failure, or the same blind spots as everything else. Physical metal offers that. It sits outside the digital chain entirely, immune to firmware flaws, immune to a hidden bug from 5 years ago, immune to whatever vulnerability AI-assisted tools might uncover next. In a financial world where nearly everything is becoming dependent on technology controlled by someone else, that kind of independence remains one of the most valuable qualities an asset can offer.